Hi, my name is Brad Jersak. I work with SSU, St. Stephen's University in New Brunswick. And today I have a special friend with me, Bruce Fisk, who taught me my first 3 semesters of Greek in the mid 80s. And then we reacquainted, I don't know when, sometime in the 2000s at a Christ at the Checkpoint conference in Bethlehem. And I had the privilege of walking around in the refugee camps after midnight with him and meeting all sorts of interesting people and doing interviews. And I've asked him to join us again today because I have some questions about what's happening in the Middle East with Israel-Palestine, with Christian Zionism over in our neck of the woods. And so welcome here, Bruce, and please let us know what you're up to, where you're at, who you're working with these days.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. Wonderful to be with you. Thanks for this chance to chat. I'm coming to you from the Andes of Peru, 10,000 feet above sea level, or 3,000 meters for Canadians. I moved here with my wife a couple of years ago, after almost 20 years of teaching New Testament and Greek at Westmont College in Southern California. So I left that gig and ventured out into unknown territory. We moved to be closer to my wife's parents, but then we decided we fell in love with the Andes and moved a short flight away from Lima to the highlands, and here I am. So I'm working, and when I'm not working, writing, and researching, I'm trekking and hiking in the Andes with my 2 dogs. So pretty happy about that.
Well, I'm so pleased to see you again. So I want to jump right in. I have so many questions for you. And so I'm not really too concerned about the time. It might be more important that we just talk about each of sort of 8 areas. First is life on the ground. What can you tell us about life on the ground in Palestine? What's it like there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we get distorted pictures, don't we, from the media. We get distorted pictures from just the U.S. Congress or the governments that pump out their perspectives. And I would say we also get distorted perspectives on the ground, even just as individuals trekking around. We don't necessarily know what we're looking at. We need help to see, and we inevitably are selective. So I don't want to pretend to be objective here. I want to just share some of my perspectives, recognizing that anything we say today is going to be contested and challenged by somebody. But with good intentions, I'll start by just saying that the situation in Israel-Palestine is really different depending on where you are. And you could call them concentric circles, or just different realities, different universes. One of those would be Israel proper. Let me just share my screen to show a couple of maps and whatnot here, and hopefully that'll work for us. How's that looking?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Working? Okay. So these are a couple of maps that should probably look familiar. The right-hand map should look most familiar with the different regions. The left one shows in blue and in pink the sort of fantasy plan of the UN for 2 states, which never happened, of course. The right map shows is that yellow? Israel proper, we'll call it. And Israel proper has been declared by the state of Israel to be the nation state of the Jewish people. So it's not a state of all its citizens. 20% of those who live in that area declared Israel, established after the guns stopped firing in 1949. 20% are Arabs. You can call them Arab Israelis, you can call them Palestinian citizens of Israel, whatever you want to call them. But what that means is that you have a state that, while it declares itself a democracy, functions as something of an ethnocracy that puts at a certain disadvantage the non-Jewish citizens. This is a problem that is certainly less severe than what you encounter in some of the other territories we're going to talk about. but it's real. And one last note about Israel proper: the Jews who live there, for the most part, don't know much at all about what's going on in the West Bank. Still less about what's going on in Gaza. They're pretty secular. I mean, they here's a little chart to show the types of Jews we have in Israel today. Secular, traditional. All of those are more or less versions of non-practicing Jews, and so they don't have much interest in Jerusalem. It's kind of a wacky religious place. Why would you go there, right? They'd rather go to the beach. And so their knowledge of sort of life on the ground in the West Bank is pretty minimal, which is unfortunate. For the most part, their exposure to it is when they do their military service and go in as soldiers, or when they go into the West Bank as settlers on nice settler roads that go into communities in the West Bank that are essentially Jewish-only communities there. So Palestinians in Israel have citizenship, but they have obstacles. They don't serve in the military, and Israel is a very military-centric society, so that puts them at a significant disadvantage. If we move then, jump in if you want to interrupt here. But
I do have one question about that. And
yeah.
So there's some sense in which, like from a Western point of view, at least in Christian Zionism, for example, like, okay, the Jews are the people of God, right? But what I saw there was that over 50% of the Jewish population in Israel proper would not identify as the people of God. Judaism, or to be Jewish, is a race, not a religion for them. Is that so? Over half of them are not practicing what we would have thought as like Jewish religion. Is that correct?
They would be nominally practicing some of the festivals and holidays, much like, say, a nominal Catholic or a nominal Protestant might celebrate Christmas. Probably more meaningful than those nominal versions of Christianity. So they still identify and see themselves as religiously Jewish, except for the crowd that is devoutly secular. So they have a historic tie, they have a cultural tie to the land, and of course they are profoundly influenced by centuries of anti-Semitism, by hostility from Christians, and they see themselves now as in a safe place. They found a refuge. So they've been persecuted for religious reasons, their heritage, their family, their ancestors. They might not think of themselves in those terms. The founding fathers of Israel didn't think of themselves as the people of God, and yet they still saw themselves with this cultural connection to ancient Israel and this cultural need for protection, right?
Okay.
The post-Holocaust reality is still very much part of the imagination. When I take students to the Holy Land for semester abroad programs, one of the first things we do is we take them to the Holocaust Memorial Museum, because you just cannot understand the modern Israeli imagination or psyche if you don't climb inside the experience of the Holocaust, and then of course the aftermath, how that experience has functioned over the decades since World War II to shape their imagination, to shape the way they view the world and the way they view their need for safety in their historic homeland.
Very good. Thank you. That's very helpful. All right, carry on.
So moving to Jerusalem, you have two Jerusalems, right? You have West and East. This map highlights the messy, chaotic East Jerusalem. In gray, you can see the borders of West Jerusalem. The line between the gray and the other part was, of course, the armistice line of 1949. West Jerusalem then faces west. It's hip, it's chill, it's fun to be in, it's modern, and it's almost entirely Jewish. And it's fun to go there. But the knowledge on the part of Jews in West Jerusalem of realities on the ground, even in a town like Bethlehem, which is at the bottom of your screen, is minimal at best. And there's a lot of fear and suspicion on both sides. So while there's no more green line, there still is this sort of invisible barrier, this psychological barrier. On then the east side of that line, you have all of the holy sites. You have all of the reasons to visit Jerusalem in the old city. Can you see the old city there in the middle?
Yeah.
And then the surrounding communities, all of the little brown areas are Palestinian built-up areas that surround the old city, but they are gradually being cut off from the rest of the West Bank by that red line, the barrier, the wall, the fence, call it what you will, and by the settlements or the communities that have been built and placed in the West Bank. That's all the purple stuff. And so between the wall and the Jewish communities, the Jewish settlements, you're increasingly cutting off the core East Jerusalem sector of the West Bank from the rest of the West Bank. So the bottom line is Israel does not want Palestinians thinking about Jerusalem as their capital, and they want to so sever the capital from the rest of the West Bank that it will just be physically impossible. The so-called facts on the ground will prevent any kind of future Palestinian Jerusalem as the capital of a Palestinian state, if that were ever to come about. So that's kind of the broad picture. Then specifically within that, then you have a lot of Palestinians who have Jerusalem residency, but not Israeli citizenship. What happened just after 1967, when the Six-Day War happened and Israel took over the old city and took over the West Bank, Israel extended the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem to include all of this area. So they kind of expanded the city of Jerusalem, but they didn't declare it Israel officially. They didn't officially annex it. And the people who live there aren't citizens. Their residency can be revoked. You know, if you're a citizen, you can't really be kicked out. But if you're a resident, you can lose your residency. And that's what's happened to many people. And there really is two tiers of society in East Jerusalem. So you've got Arabs, Palestinians who are economically at a disadvantage. They're controlled by the Israeli border police. They apply for construction, for building permits, and most of the time they get denied. Their families are growing, so they go ahead and build anyway. And now they've built illegally, which means they can be threatened with demolition. And in fact, houses are demolished. Just yesterday, or even today, there was a health center in East Jerusalem serving some 20,000 Palestinians that was demolished. Again, a military maneuver, essentially perpetuating a certain kind of two-tiered reality in East Jerusalem. Beyond that, if I could go on to talk about the West Bank more broadly, here are a couple of maps that show you the realities outside of Jerusalem. On the left, you see the Palestinian areas in brown that have been called since the 90s, areas A and B of some Oslo Accords. And they have Palestinian Authority governance and security. The blue stuff, purple or blue, is what's called Area C, and that actually is 60% of the West Bank. And here's the deal. Increasingly, Palestinians are being displaced from Area C. So it's part of the West Bank. It was part of the planned state of Palestine back in the 90s, but fewer and fewer Palestinians are living there. More and more Jews are living there. And so you really have a de facto annexation going on. It's not official. There has been talk of official annexation, but so far it's just de facto. It's in reality, there are two government systems. The Palestinians in the West Bank are, they answer to a military government. They call it the civil administration, but it's a branch of the Israeli military. And if they are arrested, they go to military courts. And so Palestinians are under one government. The Jewish settlers who live in the very same areas in the settlement communities answer to the civil court of Israel. So you have two tiers. The A word, apartheid, is thrown around a lot, and people go crazy when you use it. But there are two types of people under one broad governance. I don't know what else to call it. There's other words for it, but it's something like the apartheid of South Africa, which is what Desmond Tutu saw when he visited there, and we're mourning his death. But the Archbishop has been called anti-Semitic for seeing what he saw and declaring that two-tiered reality in the West Bank to be similar to, and he even said in some places worse than, the reality he knew in South Africa. So that we're getting off on another topic here. On the right map, you see refugee camps. So another reality, we've talked about Israel proper, then we've talked about Jerusalem, East and West. We've talked about the West Bank broadly. Then you can talk about the refugee camps. So in 1948, 750,000 residents of this area, Arab residents, fled or were forced out of their towns, and they ended up either in the West Bank or in Gaza or in surrounding countries like Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. And so all those circles represent refugee camps recognized by the UN, and lots of former or displaced Palestinians, displaced from Israel proper, are residing there, living in or around those refugee camps. There's 19 of them in the West Bank, and then lots more in the surrounding areas. Their status is more difficult. They're not confined to those camps, but that's where they can get resources if they want them. They can save up money and move out, and half of Jordan's population, maybe even more than half, is of Palestinian origin. So there's lots and lots of Palestinians abroad. And the question that they all have is, what happened in 1948, and why aren't we entitled to return to the homes and communities that we left, that we had to flee, that we were forced out of back in the day? Of course, now it's their grandchildren who are asking that question. But I have friends in refugee camps. The refugee camps tend to be, some of them in particular, tend to be hotbeds of resistance. And so some of the most invasive tactics of the Israeli military happen in some of these camps, like in Jenin, up in the northern West Bank, the Haisha camp near Bethlehem, Balata camp in Nablus. These are some of the places where you've really seen militants rise up. And of course, where you've seen groups like Hamas gain a foothold and gain a following, gain supporters, right? People who want to push back against the occupation and do so using whatever tactics they might have, including violence. And then we talked about areas A, B, and C. I don't know if we need to spend more time unless you have questions, but Gaza on this left-hand map is that little strip of 7 to 10 miles wide down there against Egypt. It ended up in Egypt's hands after 1948, but then came under Israeli control in 1967. This is the worst possible place to be. You've got something like 50% unemployment down there. There's very restricted fishing rights off the shore. Their water contamination is off the charts. Here's a little chart showing, people can pause this video if they want to read all the fine print, I suppose. But Gaza's water alone is just a crisis. You can't drink the water out of the tap. It's too contaminated either by pollutants or just the saline, the salt water that's filling in the aquifers because they've been overpumped and contaminated. You've got problems with electricity. And then, of course, you've got the government, the ruling power in the Gaza Strip has been declared a terrorist organization. And they're constantly doing things in response to Israel's incursions or initiating things, protesting action in Jerusalem, let's say. And the world calls it a war that breaks out every couple of years. It's really not a war unless you'd want to call a fight in a schoolyard sandbox between a fourth grader and a kindergartner a war. One side has high-tech weapons, U.S. backing to the point of something like $4 billion a year. The other side has smuggled in parts and built rockets in basements and garages that are not even directable. These are just kind of point, aim, and shoot rockets that are still, terrifying. But the asymmetry of the conflict in Gaza is always remarkable and needs to be kept in mind. So those are some of the areas of Jerusalem, some of the realities, and people live in those different realities and don't necessarily have much exposure to the other ones. Do you want to jump in there before we move to something else, or is that cover it?
Do you want to say something about the wall now? That's one thing I found fascinating and disturbing when I was there, and how it weaves around and separates these different, even Palestinians from their own, let's say, olive groves and stuff like that. It just seemed very strange to me.
Yeah, great point. And so the wall is one of the names for this thing that more or less, actually less, follows the green line that you can see on the map on the left that surrounds the West Bank, except that it's twice as long as that line, which means that it deviates from it, and it always deviates into the West Bank. Why? Because it's taking territory and it's including settlements at various points in the West Bank. And it's also at the same time butting up against Palestinian communities to prevent them from expanding. You can see this really clearly when you go to Bethlehem. I'm sure you remember when you're in Bethlehem, the wall on one side is urban sprawl, and on the other side, it's a huge field of olive trees. Well, those olive trees used to belong to the people on the other side of the wall, right? These were Palestinian farmers farming their olive groves. But then the wall came along, and they no longer have access to those lands. So the root of the wall, it was started in 2002 under Ariel Sharon, and it was started during the heyday or the worst days of the Second Palestinian Intifada, when the suicide bombers were a thing. And so Sharon said, all right, fine, we're going to build this wall to block these folk. But the people who were instructed to root the wall, to design the wall, were doing a lot more than stopping suicide bombers. In fact, they weren't even doing that. If you go fast forward a couple of years, the militants, including Hamas, decided to stop doing suicide bombing. And so it dropped off precipitously long before the root of the wall, but long before the wall was completed. It was, only
Bruce, you froze at long before the wall is completed, and you're still frozen.
Are we back? Oh, wait.
There you go. I heard you say, "Are we back?"
We're
So this
okay.
was long before the wall. They had already shut down the suicide bombing as a tactic.
Yeah, so it's a point of hot contention in terms of what the wall is before. And, Israelis will say, well, it sucks for the Palestinians, but, this is what was needed to keep us safe. Well, there's some truth to that, but I think a larger piece of the story is the decision, the recognition, you could say, by Palestinian militants that militarizing the conflict wasn't getting them very far. It was bringing about huge retaliations in places like Bethlehem and Jenin. People were dying. Arafat gets, locked up in his compound in Ramallah. And the PR was horrible, right? So if you're wanting to win the hearts and minds of the world, this is not the way to do it. Blowing up a bus of civilians in Tel Aviv isn't going to win you much support. So they scaled back entirely on that. They didn't renounce violence, but the sort of principal reason for the precipitous drop in terrorism was not because the wall was blocking people. I was there in the early days of the wall, and I would go with people and they would take me to dirt mounds and holes in the wall and places, and I'd go into Bethlehem or somewhere, circumventing the checkpoints to see what it was like for them. Thousands of people were coming into Jerusalem and are coming into Jerusalem on a daily basis without permits, without official permits passing through the checkpoints. Israel knows that. In fact, that sort of, you could say, off the books or under the table economy is huge for Palestine. If those folk wanted to do serious damage in Jerusalem, let's say, they could, right? They're sneaking in. So all that to say, the wall has tremendously impacted the economy. It's separated, as you said, farmers from their land. It's also separated Palestinians from Palestinians, right? Because there's all kinds of Palestinians in East Jerusalem on one side of the wall, and their grandma and their cousin is now on the other side of the wall. And the West Bank Palestinians can only enter Jerusalem legally if they have a permit. And so how do you get a permit, right? You have to apply for it. And maybe it's a religious permit for Christmas or something. But maybe it's to go to a hospital, to take your mom to get some treatment. And so there's a permit regime that's been implemented that gives Israel a tremendous amount of information about who's moving, who's where, who live. They know their intelligence, their human intelligence is phenomenal in terms of where the Palestinians are and what might work to co-opt or recruit some of those same Palestinians to become informants, which then help them, in terms of shutting down terrorist acts before they're launched or off the ground. So the wall has proved beneficial to Israeli security in many ways, and it has just devastated the economy of the Palestinians. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really kind of closed the door, realistically, on the notion of a Palestinian state with a Palestine-Jerusalem capital. If you travel the West Bank, you see that for a Palestinian state to be viable, it really needs Jerusalem. It needs East Jerusalem for all of the reasons, like the economic reasons, the pilgrimage, the tourism. If you take away East Jerusalem from the Palestinian state, you're probably guaranteeing a non-viable, defunct state before it's launched. So that's just an economic argument to include East Jerusalem. But from my perspective, I don't see that happening anytime soon. I think the two-state solution has sailed. I think that's dead. We could talk about that if you want.
I think before we head over to America and Christian Zionism and that impact, I do want to ask you about Palestinian Christians, because there is this sense that this was all about Jews versus Muslim Arabs, but I experienced a Christian Palestinian population that was in desperate radical decline because of oppressive policies. But and it was almost like, well, what shifted my perspective on this was we had someone come back from an MCC tour where they saw what you'd say a secular Jewish, we'll call bulldozers, demolishing an elementary school of Palestinian Christians while American evangelicals were cheering. And I'm like, what? And so to me, I grew up as a Christian Zionist, and that story made me really brought me to pause. I'm like, wait, there's Christians there, and we're cheering as they're being kind of bulldozed. What's going on? So what can you tell us about the Palestinian Christian population and what's happening to them?
Sure. So you're right that many Western Christians are surprised when they discover that there are Christians in the Holy Land. Sometimes Palestinian Christians will be asked, when did you convert? Which drives them crazy because they've got centuries of standing as Christians in the land. Their presence goes back many centuries. Today, the significant majority of them are Orthodox or Catholic, with a small smattering of Protestant denominations, groups that planted churches from the West in the Holy Land, in the 19th century. So you've got your Lutherans and you've got your Baptists and so on, but the majority are Greek Orthodox or some of the other Eastern Orthodoxies or Catholic. They have a much easier time emigrating to the West than their Muslim counterparts. So you do see many of them taking advantage of opportunities to leave, to come to the U.S. or to come somewhere outside. But the community there is stalwart and strong and remarkable for its resilience. You've met some of the folks in Bethlehem, I think, the Bethlehem Bible College crowd, and they have a lot to teach us. Folks like Munter Isaac, and then in the Lutheran domain, Mitzri Raheb, you've got Palestinian Christians who are finding their voice and are speaking out, and to me it's really encouraging. There's some really sharp young Palestinians coming up, Christian Palestinians. But they feel, as you point out, they feel largely kind of abandoned, forgotten, and maybe even betrayed by their Christian Western counterparts. You would think that there would be solidarity, but actually many Western Christians are much more drawn, as you alluded, to even a secular Jew in the Holy Land than to one of these strange Eastern Orthodox Christians. I mean, Eastern Orthodoxy, you have some experience with Orthodoxy. Eastern Orthodoxy looks pretty exotic when you travel to the Middle East, and Western Protestants, don't understand that. It looks kind of strange. So they're already struggling with the Orthodoxy component. But then they've got this infatuation, almost a fetishizing of the modern Jew in the Holy Land. Whether they see them as artifacts, as sort of fossils, as exotic specimens of their Bible and of the world of Jesus, whether they see them as proof that their Bible is, true, whether they see them as signs of the end times. My complaint is that a lot of times Christians see the Jews in the Holy Land as objects. They're sort of players in their either apocalyptic or apologetic drama, rather than real people with painful stories, maybe from Europe, with struggles, with devout passion for God. So there's a real disconnect in both directions. They don't really understand the Jews in the land, and they don't even recognize the Palestinian Christians. It's truly frustrating. My sense is that some of the evangelical Palestinians have gotten pretty frustrated. I don't want to say angry, but they feel quite betrayed, I think, by their, after years of attempting to reach out and to build bridges. I'm not sure they feel like they've been very successful. Maybe you've got more encouraging news to report, but you're doing some good work with the Christians there in Palestine.
Well, we do have this the development of this connection with Bethlehem Bible College, and one of the things that I was really surprised by was when I visited the Christ at the Checkpoint conference and I heard Muntler Isaac speaking. He was all about peacemaking. He wanted to give his lament for sure, but the whole reason they called the conference Christ at the Checkpoint was an encouragement to say, look, at some of us, the only connection we have with Jews is actually in the soldiers at the checkpoint, and what we need to do is to see Christ in them. But then I came home and I'm reporting that kind of, wow, we have Christian peacemakers in Palestine, and the propaganda against that conference itself was that it was promoting anti-Semitism. I'm like, where is this coming from? And maybe we could then now shift over to North America, the two realities, sort of the American political connection with Israel, and then after that shift into specifically the Christian Zionism. And what I've seen of that is also this objectification of the Jewish people who want peace. They're like, well, actually, we like the hostility because it's going to bring about Armageddon. And so there's an opposition even to the Jewish peacemakers because
Sure.
It doesn't fit our end times theology very well, right? So where do you want to start, Bruce?
Well, let me just tag on to something you said about something else we need to say about the Palestinian Christian community, and that is that they really are, you could say, caught in multiple tensions or difficulties. They are obviously Palestinian, not Israeli Jews, so they're obviously at a disadvantage. They're living in the occupation like everybody else. But then they're also not Muslim, as you point out. They're a small minority. A fraction of the total Palestinian population is Christian, and it's in decline because of immigration. And so you have tensions in both directions. If you ask Palestinians, they will, without a doubt, they will always say the principal obstacles are the occupation. That's the reality that really gets in our way the most. But there is, on the ground at least, hostility or at least pressure from the Muslim community towards the Christian community. So they also feel that. And even in places like Bethlehem, which is sort of the Christian Mecca, you have a much higher number now of Muslims living there, largely because they became refugees that moved there from towns in Israel. But now you've got Christians in the minority, even in a place like Bethlehem. And it's not always easy for them living with their Muslim neighbors, even though that story pales alongside the larger challenge they face of living under Israeli occupation. In terms of the US, I think the broader realities that are hard to dispute are that Israel has not been an honest broker in the process. They're supposedly did I say Israel? The US has not been an honest broker in the peace process. They have, since World War II, increasingly had their fingers in the Middle East pie, but they've not been genuinely even-handed by any stretch. There's a book out, just came out. Well, it came out a few years ago now. Rashid Khalidi, who's a Columbia history professor, Palestinian. Anything the guy writes is worth reading. But he wrote a book called "Brokers of Deceit: How the U.S. Has Undermined Peace in the Middle East." That's says it in a nutshell. I don't think you could argue the opposite successfully. The question then is, why? right? Why has the U.S. not been more effective? And this is where it's sort of above my pay grade. I mean, who are the players influencing U.S. foreign policy? Well, you've got oil, right? You've got the military-industrial complex. You've got Islamophobia, especially since 9/11, and the so-called war on terror that's influencing people's imaginations and the way they think about Muslims. You've got the Jewish lobby, groups like AIPAC that exert pressure. And then you've got the Christian Zionists who are in the mix as well. And one of the questions I can't answer, because it's not my area, is, which of these players is really the most influential? Which ones are sort of riding along? I'd say it's pretty certain to say that the Christian Zionist influence or Christian influence in support of Israel has radically increased over the last half century. Their pressures and their lobbying has gone really through the roof, culminating with folks like John Hagee and his group Christians United for Israel, culminating with the players that surrounded Donald Trump during his presidency. So you have really since the 1960s, I would say that 1967 is a watershed, because when Jerusalem gets reunited or captured, call it what you will, and Jews are now in control of the old city, which means they're in control of the Temple Mount. This was just huge for Christian Zionists, who could kind of look around and say, see, we were right. We're in the last days. This is exciting. Isn't it great to be alive? And we're watching God's plan unfold. Next thing you know, there's going to be a third temple. The unfortunate thing is that it's got to be built where the first and second temples once stood, which happens to be the very same place where the Dome of the Rock, the Muslim shrine, has been sitting for 1,300 years. So, well, I guess we'll have to do something about that, right? And so you've got militant minds and militant imaginations amongst Christian Zionists who want to see a war, who want to see a conflict, who want to see something that would enable a third temple to be built, either before or shortly after the return of Jesus. So yeah, all of that has fed into U.S. foreign policy. As I said, you'll have to bring somebody else on your podcast who can talk to you about the relative sort of weights and the relative influences of these different groups. But it is remarkable. Wasn't it remarkable to listen to even people like Vice President Mike Pence and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo? I mean, these guys are, they're Christian Zionists, and they're shaping U.S. policy in the Middle East in accord with a hermeneutic, a way of reading the Bible that I think is profoundly flawed. More important than that, it's a hermeneutic that's getting people hurt, right, on the ground. Little people are being affected in terms not just of their human rights, but their lives by the kind of militant agenda that some of these folk are fine with.
Well, let's talk about that. The hermeneutic, like the use and misuse of the scriptures towards sort of a Christian Zionist bent, and at this, in contrast to the Hebrew Jewish prophetic tradition. You're also a Bible guy. So what's going on there? What's the hermeneutic, and how would you push back?
Yeah, all of the stuff I've been saying so far is out of my specialization. So I'm making stuff up, but it is my passion. So it's something I care a lot about and read a lot about. But yeah, my background is in New Testament and early Christianity and early Judaism. I did a PhD in the 90s at Duke University in that domain. So I care a lot about how we read the Bible, and how the Bible has been weaponized. But honestly, I'm in conversation these days with Christian Zionists who aren't just sort of the crazy apocalyptics that are setting dates and predicting the end around the corner. Christian Zionism is not one thing. And, I've been learning this more and more. And now that I'm living in the global South, I'm seeing other faces of Christian Zionism, other than the ones that we're most familiar with, coming out of maybe a Dallas Seminary dispensationalism or a John Hagee Pentecostalism, just to kind of diverge. So global South Christian Zionism is something of a marriage with prosperity theology. And so one of the verses that you hear cited a lot, and this could be even cited from a political podium, is Genesis 12, verse 3, which says, I will bless you, Abraham. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. And in you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So you have this verse that has become almost a mantra in certain prosperity theology circles, used to promise not just personal blessing, if I bless the modern nation state of Israel, but nationally, if we as a nation bless the modern state of Israel, God's going to bless us. And you've got Pentecostals saying that in the US, but you've also got them saying that in Guatemala, right? You've got them saying that in the global South, where they're wanting to kind of ride this verse to prosperity. How? By showing political and moral and economic support for the modern state of Israel, which of course raises the question, what's the relationship between Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the ancient Israelites and this modern thing we call the nation state that exists today, right? That's one of the big discussion points. What's encouraging to me in some of my conversations is that there is I could say another version of Christian Zionism that is pushing away from prosperity theology, it's pushing away from apocalypticism, and it's trying to inject a little bit more serious biblical scholarship. There was a book published a few years ago edited by Gerald McDermott, The New Christian Zionism, maybe you saw it, and it had a collection of essays. Some of the writers were from Dallas Seminary, Darrell Bach, Joel Willits, a friend of mine who teaches at North Park University. These guys are writing and they're trying to make a biblical hermeneutical case for Christian Zionism. And so I say, bring it on. Let's have that conversation. Like, let's think carefully together about how to read the Old Testament. And then fundamentally, how do Christians read the Old Testament as part of the Christian Bible, right? The question is, now that Jesus has come, now that he has started this or expanded this movement, this people of God thing, to include Gentiles, not as proselytes, not as converts who are required to observe Torah and essentially become Jews, but as Gentiles. What do we do with the promises of the Torah, the expectations of restoration of the prophets, now that Jesus has come? And I want to argue that that's kind of the thing that gets the New Testament authors out of bed in the morning. Like, this is the issue that they're struggling with. This is the issue that they're working through. And here's where I might get myself in trouble. I'm not sure they all land exactly in the same place. It seems to me they all have slightly different perspectives on what to think about their prophetic tradition that really did hope for and expect a territorial national restoration as part of some future golden age, right? I mean, this is where the Christian Zionists can point to all sorts of scripture to build their case. I can share my screen again and just put a few of those texts up on the screen just to remind us.
Which, by the way, might not be how a Jewish rabbi interprets these same scriptures.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So yeah, I mean, there's no one Jewish hermeneutic either, right?
Right.
But you've got on the screen, you've got Genesis 12:3, which is the hands down favorite verse that gets cited. and alluded to. But you've got other verses in the Psalms and the prophets that highlight the centrality of Jerusalem. And you've got, let me just put, here's some other stuff. Let me put this screen up. Here are some hopes of restoration. Here's Isaiah 5. The ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing, Jerusalem. Ezekiel, though I remove them from far away among the nations, I will gather you from the peoples. I will give you the land of Israel. So the question is, I guess, was that stuff fulfilled post-Babylonian exile, or did those prophecies still get kind of bounced forward? And when Jesus' disciples were thinking about this stuff, did they have a living expectation of some kind of future glorious restoration that would be national, political, territorial, or had all of that gone away? And I think you can make an argument that in the New Testament, you've got voices that point in maybe in both directions. So here I'm asking the question, did the followers of Jesus have a land theology, right? Did they have some kind of expectation of not just being in the land, they were in the land, but actually sort of controlling the land? Perhaps you could think back to the Maccabean era, when for about a century, Jews were in control. Prior to that, of course, the kingdoms of the north and the south. But after that, it was, whether it were the Greeks or the Romans or what have you, the Christians, the Byzantines, they didn't have control. Well, what do we see in the New Testament? Take Matthew 19. The disciples are saying, hey, what's in it for us? And Jesus says, you who have followed me will sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes. Now, I'm not convinced that we need to treat those thrones as literal thrones in Jesus' imagination here, any more than many of his other metaphors need to be taken literally. I don't expect that Jesus is going to return riding a horse with a sword in his teeth. I mean, there's many metaphors for the return and for the apocalypse, for the eschaton. But you can imagine a Christian Zionist looking at that and saying, you know what? It seems like Jesus has some kind of expectation, not just for the world, but for his people, right? I mean, you wouldn't be insane to conclude that from a verse like that. The disciples in Acts 1, just before Jesus ascends to heaven. So is this the time when you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel? And Jesus doesn't say, hey, idiots, haven't you been listening? He says, never mind, I've got a job for you. You're going to be my witnesses here and to the ends of the earth. So it seems like you have verses that a good-intentioned, competent reader of the Christian Zionist disposition could read and say, look, there seems to be some kind of territorialism in the New Testament. Then I look at some of these other verses in the no half of the screen here, and I think, that seems like we're going in a really different direction. Jesus with the woman at the well and the Samaritan woman, there's a time coming when you worship neither on this mountain here in Samaria, nor in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is not going to be the center. Okay. Hebrews talks about a Sabbath rest for the people of God, and he's not talking about the land. Revelation talks about the holy city descending, but he's not talking about a city, he's talking about a people. So you've got this other thread in the New Testament that is leaning away from ethnic particularity towards something much bigger, towards a global people of God. And of course, this is the trajectory that I think is more dominant. It's the louder voice, the majority report in the New Testament. And it seems to me the one that I, think makes the most sense of most of the evidence. Take a look at Galatians 3, verse 29. If you belong to Christ, Paul's writing to these Gentiles, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. That sounds like Gentiles are inheriting the promises, right? That they're, in a sense, legitimate offspring of Abraham, not because they're following the law and getting circumcised, but because they're belonging to Christ. So what does it mean for Gentiles to inherit the promises, at the center of which, or near the center of which, is the promise of land, the promise of territory, the promise of inheriting the land? I think that's one of the questions at the heart of this debate. If you're going to have a serious conversation with Christian Zionists, right? If you're not going to just throw the book across the room because they're talking about date setting and the third temple, if you're not going to throw the book across the room because they're talking about prosperity theology and getting rich and healthy because you're sending money to Israel, what about this conversation? This is the conversation I want to have with I want to say, more responsible and engaged, biblically sophisticated readers of Scripture. I'd love to hear you react to some of this, Brad, as you think about it from your vantage point.
Yeah, I tend to see that the fulfillment specifically of the new temple from John chapter 2. The temple Jesus is talking about is the temple of his body fulfilled in his resurrection. And then flowing from that, the body of Christ are the new temple, the living stones that make this up. And that so I could understand some Jewish aspirations for a third temple. I don't understand Christian aspirations for a new temple that would involve the reinstitution of a Jewish priesthood with a sacrificial system, with all that we've said about Christ fulfilling that. And so, I was down at the Wailing Wall and I got to talk. I got to talk to one of the students of a rabbi who was also, he didn't talk to me, but he was like 2 feet away listening to his disciple talking to me. And I'm like, so do you foresee a reconstruction of a temple, a third temple? And he said, oh yes, but it has to be a miracle. It can't be a demolition. It can't be someone blowing up a bomb. It has to be direct divine intervention. I said, okay, so then in terms of that new temple, would it be a museum or a functioning temple with a real priesthood and an active sacrificial system? And he said, oh yeah, no, it's not a museum. And the priests would not be museum guides. This would be a real sacrificial system. I can understand a Jewish impulse toward that from some of the rabbis. What I don't understand Christians like breeding red heifers for this to happen. What does this mean in terms of Christ, and what does it mean? And so I tend to have that patristic and I think apostolic view of the fulfillment of all these promises in Christ, in the temple of his movement of disciples, and that the sacrificial system is fulfilled completely for all people at the cross. So that's sort of where I come from.
Well, and I want to say everything. I want to say amen to everything you've just said. I think you're right to point to John chapter 2, and John's gospel in general celebrates Jesus as the fulfillment of the hopes and the aspirations of all the institutions and systems of Israel. And I think this is in some ways the Achilles heel of Christian Zionism. Certainly the old school of Christian Zionism did talk about a third temple a lot. And they had to sort of hem and haw, like, well, what do you do at a temple, right? I mean, the reason for having a temple is to slaughter animals and to burn them. I mean, that's what temples were for. Sure, it was a place to hold your money, and it was a place to, hide when the armies were attacking. But the central function of a temple was this this animal sacrifice ritual that Christians seem to have found fulfilled in Jesus. So I'm totally with you on that page.
Can I add one more?
Along,
Let me add one more thing.
Yeah.
So when I talk that way, sometimes I get accused of replacement theology. And I'm like, I am not saying that Christians replace the Jews. I'm saying that Christ is the fulfillment of all the promises of God. And so it's Christ replaces the temple, the Torah, the sacrificial system. It's a different kind of replacement than what I think we're accused of at that point.
Yeah, and that term is so loaded, isn't it? I mean, you go to Matthew, and the first half of Matthew's gospel more or less presents Jesus as Israel.
Yeah,
Jesus is rehearsing the story of Israel. Now, he doesn't replace Israel. It's more like he embodies Israel in a person.
A recapitulation or something.
Recapitulation. Yeah, there's all these words we can use, and I think the language of replacement theology applies to certain eras of Christian history. Supersessionism applies to certain eras, but these days, an awful lot of that talk is effectively shutting down a conversation. Effectively, it says, you're guilty of this, and so I don't have to deal with you.
Yeah.
Other people talk about fulfillment theology. Gary Burge likes that language. You hear talk about transference theology. I need to do more work on this. I kind of just like the language of inclusion.
Okay.
Inclusion theology. So it's not that the church, it's totally anachronistic to say the church replaced Israel. Paul couldn't have thought that. Right?
No.
What he's saying is Israel now includes, surprisingly, Gentiles, but not based upon Torah, right? Not based upon their subscription to circumcision and kosher, but rather based upon their relationship to the quintessential Israelite. So it's more like it's not that the church has replaced Israel. We use the term church maybe misleadingly to describe this inclusive, expansive people of God whose other name is Israel. I don't think replacement or supersession applies when you think of it in those terms.
No, that makes sense to me, and especially if you think in terms of Jeremiah 31 to 33, where it's talking about God making a new covenant with Israel, whatever Israel is, and that it's
with
going
the house of Israel and the house of Judah.
Yeah, and
very ethnic.
So it's their covenant, and it's an inclusive covenant. So that works for me. It's not like, well, we're going to convert out of Judaism now. It is Genesis 12. It's now going to have a global implication, and the land is going to be the size of the world, and the people are going to include all nations. So I think I'm with. No, I know I'm with you on this idea. I just think inclusion, really, that is a helpful language. Thank you.
Yeah, and you have another theme in the prophets that you might call pilgrimage to Zion imagery. Okay. The fantasy or the vision was of the nation seeing this light on a hill, this city on a hill, Israel, seeing God blessing it, and recognizing finally that all of their pagan, religions and ideologies should be set aside, and they should embrace the God of Israel. And so then they're going to bring their gifts, right? They're going to make pilgrimage to Zion to make offerings in the temple. This is one of the ways the prophets imagined the final, rescue of the world through Israel. And so how did the earliest Christians then, including the apostles, the authors of the New Testament, incorporate that kind of thinking? Well, the disciples go to the ends of the earth, and they bring Gentiles into the light of the gospel, and those Gentiles then send gifts to Jerusalem, right? They're thanking the mothership, they're thanking Mother Israel, Mother Jerusalem, for the gift of salvation that they've incurred and that they've received. That is the Gentile pilgrimage, but it's based upon the good news of the gospel that welcomes them in. So I think with all of these prophetic hopes of restoration and of global redemption, the earliest Christians were just kind of, how do we think about this now? Now that we've decided Jesus is our Messiah, and now that God raised this one from the dead, what do we do with all this stuff that we've been, reading all our lives? My mentor at Duke, Richard Hayes, talks about reading backwards, right? They were driven back to reread their scripture in light of this new reality, namely that God approved of Jesus by raising him from the dead. That forces them to go back and, with the assumption of Jesus' messiahship, reread their Bible and say, well, how does that hope that for sure in the minds of the prophets was ethnic and territorial and political, how does that hope now look in light of the new discovery that we've made, that God's plan includes a crucified and risen Messiah? It's fascinating. I think we catch them in the New Testament in the hermeneutical act of rethinking that question.
And beginning on the road to Emmaus, right? And so,
yes.
Christ shows them from the law, the Psalms, and the prophets how all of these things are pointing, prefiguring. The characters and the events, the history and the prophecies of Israel prefigure something they could not have seen until it happened, which was that the Messiah must suffer and then come into his glory. And so this is the culmination of the Jewish dream and the Jewish promises in my mind.
If you ask a religious, devout Jew who's not a follower of Jesus today, why don't you follow Jesus, right? Why isn't he the Messiah? Most of them one of their top reasons will be, well, look around you. Where's the golden age? Where's the messianic bliss, the security, where's the Garden of Eden, right? They'll point to the brokenness of our world and say, this proves that he didn't inaugurate some messianic age. When the Messiah comes, it's all going to be way better than this, and that's a compelling argument on one level. I think you have to take that seriously and respect that. And that's again how the earliest Christians were thinking. Okay, in what sense did Jesus inaugurate the messianic age or the kingdom? In what sense is it here now? And in what sense are we still, expecting it to come? And of course, we have a doctrine or a theology of the second coming of Jesus. So we have a doctrine of the inaugurated kingdom as sort of our answers to their question. But it's all, again, I think, important to recognize and respect the Hebrew Bible or the Jewish traditions, the prophetic hopes of restoration. If we don't really give that full weight, we're certainly not going to have a conversation with religious Jews that goes anywhere, nor, I think, are we going to have serious conversation with Christian Zionists.
Yeah. Let me run one thing by you. I don't know if it's helpful or not. It was helpful for me in one single conversation. So I don't know that it's a good route to go, but I think you're the person to kind of measure it. So a friend of mine who's a devout Christian Zionist, there's no way I could sell him on this different hermeneutic. And so I had to start from a place of saying, okay, let's pretend that, let me do a thought experiment where I say what you're saying about the Old Testament promises are fulfilled in the modern state of Israel. If I had to concede that, what would my questions be? And if we're going to root the current political scene in the our Old Testament, then and if I'm going to share in his love for the current manifestation of it and want to see it blessed, want to see it succeed, then I see two contingencies from the Hebrew prophets themselves, which he's drawing his hermeneutic from. And those two are that the relationship of the land, according to the Hebrew prophets, is dependent on treatment of strangers in the land, and a resistance to any military alliance with a foreign empire. So if I love Israel and don't want to see it destroyed, then I should be exhorting them to take care of the Palestinian peoples in the land, and definitely to break all ties with America. And he's like, oh, I never thought of that. I'll have to go think of that. But am I conceding too much already there in that conversation? Or, what do you make of those kind of contingencies?
Yeah. I think it is a fruitful line of thought. Gary Burge in his book, Whose Land, Whose Promise, follows that line of thinking as well. So if you haven't seen that, you could go back and look at his book. But he wants to say, okay, let's hypothetically grant a connection between the Hebrew Bible Israel and the modern nation state, which is a huge hypothetical, right? It's a big if.
Yeah.
It has lots of problems. But if I'm going to go with you on that, then yeah, what standards? If let's say, put it this way, if modern Israel is covenantally qualified to be in the land, are they morally qualified to be in the land? Right, and that's another way of asking the question you're asking.
Well, and even that if they break those two conditions, they will be destroyed. So I thought you loved Israel, because I love Israel,
right?
But I thought you did too. So,
and you will find in some of these new Christian Zionists, I'm thinking now of a Messianic Rabbi Mark Kinzer, who's well worth reading. Almost all Messianic Jews are Christian Zionists. I don't know any who are not.
Okay.
So he wants to say, there's no absolute guarantee that this version of Israel is the final one. In other words, there could be another exile, right? This state of Israel isn't necessarily the thing. Now, I think behind closed doors, most Christian Zionists would say, yeah, we're pretty sure this is it. We're pretty sure that the 1948 was a miracle. 1967 was another miracle, that God is moving in our day, and this Israel that we see around us is the return. And now all we have to do is wait for them to come to Jesus, right? There's going to be not just a return to the land, but a return to God, and that's going to include restoration to the Messiah. So in reality, most of them do think that this is it. But I think it's a great argument. I think the hypothetical nature of the question has to be highlighted, and you have to go back and say, okay, well, what is the difference between a modern nation state, like the ones that emerged out of the 19th century in Europe, and European nationalism, and Israel as a people, Israel as a nation? There's a huge difference between a nation and a nation state. There are lots and lots of nations around the world, peoples, like, for example, the Quebecois, the French nation of Canada, that don't have a state, right? And so this thing called a nation state is a modern construct. And does it get to, benefit from the biblical covenantal language as part of its modern political project? That's, I think, a huge issue that, it is discussed, but it has to be brought out front. Because you have an Israel today that is founded as a secular, liberal, they call themselves a liberal democracy. I still want to say it's more of an ethnocracy, but it's not founded on Torah. It's founded on the rule of law. And Israel today does not have a constitution. They have what are called basic laws. Why don't they have a constitution? Because the religious Jews would have gone crazy, because that would have been replacing Torah as their constitution. So instead, what they have are a series of basic laws that get passed that function as a constitution. And but it's secular in that sense. It protects Judaism. It welcomes Jews. It celebrates Jewish culture and tradition. But it's not a people of God by its own self-description. Ben-Gurion never went to synagogue. Herzl was secular. These guys that are the founding fathers are not believers in God, even though I suppose sometimes they use that very belief or that very sort of Jewish pietistic tradition as support for their project, for their political nation-state project.
Yeah, I do want to hear that. I do, I want to hear what actual Jews have to say about it, right? And so one example of that is Rabbi Jacob Shapiro, and he's basically said, look at Christian Zionism is anti-Semitic, and his point of view is that how does he say this? That Zionism took root and continues to inform Christian relationship to Israel, but it's specifically identifying Jews. His question is, what is a Jew? And he thinks that Zionism has moved Jewish identity away from covenant and commandments. And he's like, you've got some people, is a Jew a race? Is it a political identity? Or is it something to do with faithfulness to commandments? So here's a Jewish rabbi who's just like, every time you do something to move Jewishness into an ethnicity, well then, or into a political kind of reality, then you're moving it away from faithfulness to covenant. And so that'd be one example of a counterpoint I found really remarkable, and controversial too, right? To actually say Zionism is anti-Semitic.
Well, and it took quite a while in Herzl's day in the late 19th century and early 20th century for religious Jews to get on board with the Zionist project. Initially, it was a secular project, and the religious Jews were saying, no, don't, let God bring us back. Don't try to, push God's hand. You're creating something secular. And even in recent days, some of the most passionate supporters of Palestinians have come from the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. So you have sort of an anti-nationalism within religious Jewish orthodoxy that is fascinating to look at. When I hear people say, and Jews critics of Christian Zionists will say this, that Christian Zionism is anti-Semitic, I want to say that's too easy. There are absolutely anti-Zionists who are anti-Semitic, and Zionists that are anti-Semitic, and there are Christian Zionists who are, and Christian Zionists who are not. So you have to look at it more up close. One of the reasons it gets called anti-Semitic is legitimate, and that is that Jews, as I mentioned earlier, are more or less just players or objects or bit parts in their apocalyptic theater.
Yeah.
So they're not really I'm supporting Israel, but so that, as you said, Armageddon can come, or so that the end can come and Jesus can come back. And oh, by the way, in my little timeline, a bunch of you Jews are going to burn. That kind of rhetoric and theology, I can understand being problematic, but it also comes up in conversation that because Christians want to convert Jews or recruit Jews or turn them to Jesus, that's somehow anti-Semitic. And I just think that's a statement of our times. Like, Christianity has been a missionary religion from day one, just like Islam has been a missionary religion from day one. Well, if you think you've got the truth, and if you think you've found something and you want to convince other people of it, that doesn't mean you hate them, right? So the missionary impulse of Christianity per se, it's silly to call that anti-Semitic. It wasn't anti-Roman for Paul to speak to the Romans about Jesus. It was pro-Jesus, right? So I want to nuance that whole discussion a little bit.
Yeah. And you want to steel man it too, right? Not just straw man it, but to say, okay, what's the best of scholarship doing with this? We should probably start heading in for a landing, and but on that point, I'm thinking about the difficulty of these conversations and getting somewhere without it just being, you know, throwing around anti-Semitic or throwing around supersessionist or, you know, things that close down the conversation. But I'm also aware of the tendency towards burnout, like especially for those on the ground there, but then also for people like you in ministries that are trying to do good work in terms of peace building. I read an article about burnout yesterday, and it said burnout is more than exhaustion. Burnout also includes an element of cynicism that depersonalizes. So let's say if you're depersonalizing Jewish people and their plight, or you're depersonalizing Palestinians, Muslim or Christian, so you end up that creates a kind of a cynicism that they're just objectified. And then on top of that, the third thing was exhaustion, cynicism, and then ineffectuality. So the idea is this isn't working. We're not getting anywhere. And it's a little bit like with the pandemic. You've got people, let's say doctors and nurses, who are they're exhausted, but also they're becoming cynical as things are loading up with patients who aren't cooperating with them and then become abusive. And then on top of that, the numbers aren't getting better, or what, you know, that leads to burnout. And I feel that very quickly when I come around this conversation, where it's like, I'm frustrated with the other, whoever I make that out to be. I am frustrated with my sense of powerlessness, even especially when I'm talking to best friends and I can't budge them at all. And I'm like, but so even someone who I'm in a committed relationship with, and I'm like, if I can't convince you of another way of seeing, then like, so I am wondering how it is you come to this in a situation that can feel hopeless, and in ministries where it is a hard slug. How do you do it? What do you see as a way forward?
So important. And of course, both of us as outsiders and privileged white males, I mean, it's an option for us to care about this stuff, you could say. And people on the ground in the middle of it, you know, they don't have that option. It's their reality. So I couch everything I say and think about this with that in mind, keeping in mind that I'm privileged to speak into this conversation and to engage people in dialogue, but I hold I want to call myself to epistemic humility and to a certain kind of respect for views that seem to me really wrong-headed and profoundly unhelpful. How do I stay hopeful? I mean, some of the answers to that question are something like, oh, well, the situation is unsustainable. Something's got to give, right? It can't go on like this forever. That's not what gives me hope. I see Israel basically winning on many fronts. It's hard to imagine the Christian Zionist lobby, if there is a single thing called that, being dislodged anytime soon. The US has such strong interests in the region and sees Israel as its, partner. So what can we expect the next chapter to include? It is encouraging in a kind of a weird, dark way to see Israel increasingly saying the quiet parts out loud. They're basically saying, we're not going to allow a two-state solution. We've finally gotten rid of Netanyahu, but the people that came in his wake are just as committed to preventing a Palestinian state from arising. So the world may finally hear that the Zionist project is not about sharing the land, but it's about control of the land. Whether they find that persuasive or not, that seems to be the message that's coming out louder and clearer. Where do I find hope? I think the hope is on the ground in some ways. I think when I have taken students and they've traveled and mingled with Jews and Palestinians, when they brought over their maybe ill-conceived theologies and then brought that into conversation with the reality on the ground, if people visit, if people actually go, not everybody can travel, and certainly not now, but not everybody is wealthy enough to get on a plane and go. But those who can go, if they go and then if they travel in thoughtful ways that engage people from all different sources and conversations and communities, I think the realities on the ground kind of do the work for us, and in some ways open eyes to things that they would never see just by reading books or getting in a debate. When I send students home from programs over there, they've lived over there for 15 weeks. Some of them think they're now experts, and I tell them, no, you don't know anything yet. You're just getting started. But I say, when you go home, don't argue with Uncle Biff. Just tell them stories. Just tell them your experiences of the delightful conversations that you've had with that Jew at the Western Wall or with that Palestinian in Manger Square. Tell them about your experiences in settlements and in refugee camps. And he can't argue with that, right? I mean, you're bringing back some pretty authentic testimony that I've seen make a big difference. I also think that in terms of the Christian Zionist community, as I've tried to argue, there are various sort of slices of that. Some of them are probably not movable, but I think there is this vast movable middle of Christians who are default sort of Israel flag waving Christian Zionists, maybe because they've never heard of any other perspective, or they just think that, well, Jesus was a Jew. Most of my Bible is Jewish. All of my Bible is Jewish. Obviously, we're on that team, right? And they've got in the back of their mind, they've got 9/11, and they've got Islamophobia and the war on terror, and they've got all these other reasons external to their theology that tilts them in that direction. But there's a movable middle there, and I think that's especially true of the younger generation, the 35 and under crowd, who aren't nearly as committed as their parents were to sort of an ideological, entrenchment. The buzz around 1967 has long dissipated, and they're no longer living in that apocalyptic fervor. The Y2K, that was our generation. I mean, this generation coming up doesn't have a lot of that baggage, and they seem more interested in holding out for the rights of their Palestinian or Muslim or Jewish friends than they are in sort of winning some ideological battle. I'm encouraged by that. I think I see the same thing on the ground amongst Palestinians in the West Bank. The 40 and under Palestinians, they don't really care too much about a two-state solution anymore. They've grown up under occupation. They've grown up without human rights, without certain human rights. They just kind of want to get on with their lives, get a decent job, get an education, have kids, and they want to do that in a way that's respectful of their human rights. The older crowd that are all sort of moving out to pasture, they're still waving the two-state solution flag. That's over. I think that's over. I think we need to recognize that and move on to say, all right, we're here, we're not going away. How about if you give us a vote, citizenship, full equality? That's what we're asking for. How can you argue with that, right? I mean, that's a pretty hard one to argue with. There are arguments, but they're not persuasive. So I want to say that on both this side and the other side of the Atlantic, the younger generation brings me hope. it gives me, hope that we can maybe move the ball down the field. I'm also arguing, and I've got an article waiting to be published on this, that what really needs to happen among Christian Zionists is that they really need to recognize that their idea of blessing Israel isn't helpful and isn't working. And there are so many better ways to bless Israel than the way they're going about it. They want to throw money at settlements. They want to put pressure in Washington for certain laws to be passed. But there are other ways to show your love for the Jews that aren't exclusive, and they don't displace and disenfranchise and marginalize the Palestinian people. And that's a conversation that I'm really trying to encourage, that we can bless Israel at the same time that we stand up for the kinds of biblical principles of justice and human rights that aren't being recognized. The two are not mutually exclusive. So those are some of the ways I kind of hang on to a little bit of hope, right?
I find that really encouraging, because if to distill what you said, if I heard you right, it's like on the Palestinian side, the younger generation doesn't remember being displaced. They've grown up that way, and on the Christian Zionist side, I remember the euphoria of the Yom Kippur War and thinking Christ is coming next week, but my kids have no memory of that, and so they, on both sides, there's probably way more space to, like, the distance from those kind of things, that creates some space.
Yeah, and you add to that the pluralism of our society in the West. Now I realize it's very binary, very polarized these days, but kids in college, their friend circles are very diverse. If they're exposed to people from other cultures, they welcome them in, and they're not waving ethnic, flags. I don't know how to put that together with the rise of Christian nationalism. So this is not something I'm an expert on, but yeah, I'm encouraged by the mindset, the openness, the inclusivity of a lot of the younger generation, and we can pass the baton to them. I suppose we have to.
Is there anything we missed talking about that an hour from now we'll be kicking ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, probably lots. I mean, we touched on some of Israel's policies toward the Palestinians. We've touched on anti-Semitism and what's called the new anti-Semitism. Or we might have mentioned that this is the language that we're going to hear more and more of in coming years. It's been around for a decade or two, but we've seen this even this week with was it Emma Watson, who posted on social media. She's the British actress who's actually quite an activist and feminist, and she posted something about solidarity with the Palestinians, and she's just being attacked as an anti-Semite, and so the language of anti-Semitism is being weaponized to talk about anti-Zionism or criticism of Israel. And in the circles that I'm trying to work in terms of the Christian Zionist community, it is incredibly hard to get them to say anything specifically critical about Israel. They'll say the following. They'll say, Israel isn't perfect, or we're not giving Israel a carte blanche, right? They'll say generic statements like that make it sound like they're taking the situation on the ground seriously. But try to find in one of their writings, even the scholars that I'm talking to, try to find in their writings any specific beefs, complaints, criticisms. They're very reluctant to do that. And that's something we've got to work on. We've got to say, listen, you can be a Jeremiah, you can be a John the Baptist and speak prophetically to a people you love and not desire their destruction. You can speak hard words and it might get you in trouble, but that's that's kind of the prophetic way, right? And that's kind of the calling we all have.
It is the beauty, the genius and beauty of the Jewish prophetic tradition is that there is no religious tradition as self-critical within their own texts. I mean, it's just actually gorgeous and very validating. I have one last question, and then we'll just have you do a promo for what you're up to again. I didn't warn you about this question, but I know you're an expert on it, so it won't be a problem. How do you respond to this charge that the Gospels are anti-Semitic?
There's three of us New Testament scholars, you probably know the names of the other two, who are talking about trying to work on that question or to write on that question. And it's not a new one, of course. Particularly Matthew and John, right, are the two Gospels that get labeled anti-Semitic, or at least if you avoid the anachronism, right? And so then the argument is they're anti-Jewish because they're written post-70 in this parting of the ways environment where Christians have gone off in this direction, predominantly Gentile. Jews have gone off over here. They're struggling with the demise of Jerusalem. And that's the seeds that have been planted that later give fruit to something called anti-Semitism. Christian anti-Semitism comes from New Testament anti-Judaism. That's the argument, right? And then other people say, no, the New Testament is anti-Semitic. The way I would say that that John 8, for example, is difficult. It's not fun to read, and it shows, and Matthew 23 similarly, it shows Jesus engaged in a very Middle Eastern, no holds barred battle for ideas. And the writers of Matthew and John are likewise engaged in a hermeneutical battle, saying, you know what, Jesus and his people, we're the ones who read scripture correctly, and you guys have missed something. You've missed the Jesus piece, and you're now missing out. Let us, persuade you. And it's a knockdown, drag out hermeneutical battle that's going on. And in that context, of course, you have, sarcasm and hyperbole and really strong language. You see the same thing over there today, by the way, right? Mm-hmm. That kind of communication hasn't gone away. But what I would say, my main response to your question is that when Matthew and John were written, they were written by Jews in a Jewish context. And that becomes this prophetic critique that you talked about a moment ago, this internal prophetic critique that Jeremiah exemplifies, but so does Jesus in John and Matthew. They're waging prophetic critique within their community. What happens is when you take those books and you move down the timeline a little bit and you drop them back into the Christian community that now looks very un-Jewish. It looks like it's a whole different religion. Now you drop those same sayings into that context, and it sounds very anti-Jewish, and it could even sound anti-Semitic. So I want to argue that a big part of this discussion and this response needs to recognize the difference between the original settings of those harsh critiques and the subsequent location of those critiques in a community that looks, regrettably, like another religion criticizing Judaism. How does that sound to you? What do you think about that?
Yeah, that sounds right to me. And you've got a couple stages there. So one is I do see probably, let's say in John, in the immediate context of Jesus' debates with the folks, I'm wondering if even the Greek term there is identifying the Jewish temple, the Judean temple establishment as over against the Galilean Jesus ministry or something. And then later, still in-house, but pro-Jesus and anti-Jesus people within the synagogues fighting as Christian exclusion from the synagogues begins in later in the century, and then what you're describing then becomes full blown later. Am I warm there? What do you think about that approach?
Yeah. So you've raised a couple of other great points. One is the term Judaios, Jew or Judean. What did that refer to? When John consistently talks about the Jews, but it's kind of bizarre because the very same gospel is referring to other characters who are Jewish, including, of course, Jesus. So what do you mean the Jews? So it seems anachronistic in some sense. And so some have argued, as you point out, that it refers to Judeans, the Southerners.
Or at least the Sanhedrin and their...
Right, the Jewish leadership, yeah. And that's how it's often paraphrased. The Jewish leaders said this and that. And certainly, Jesus had much more antagonism, or there was much more opposition between him and the Sanhedrin or the Sadducees. They're running the temple. The Pharisees and Jesus could have good arguments, but the Sadducees, not so much. They're in charge, and they have a lot to lose if Rome sees the Jesus movement as somehow a quasi, rebellion movement, a quasi revolution. And of course, they do lose everything. When the temple is destroyed, the Sadducees go out of business, and the Pharisees and their traditions are what eventually become, what we call rabbinic Judaism. So certainly on the ground, in the context of the interrogations of Jesus in the last part of John's gospel, it is the Jewish leaders that are, worrying about this false prophet amongst them, worrying about the Roman incursions, and wanting to get rid of this guy to save everybody, right? I assume the best of those guys. I assume that they really did see a false prophet and worried about what God would think and worried about what the Romans would think if this false prophet really got, his movement got launched. So they needed to get rid of him. That goes right back to Deuteronomy and what you do with a false prophet. I don't know if you can read John's gospel completely in that voice. You do have that interesting discussion in John 9, where there's a threat of being kicked out of the synagogue that also sounds a little bit anachronistic.
Yeah.
And some scholars have tried to argue that is what's called a two-level narrative. There's the narrative of Jesus going on down here, and then there's this later
John's community, yeah,
John's community thing going on, where now they are kicking Jesus following Jews out of the synagogue. And so the writer has put that later conflict back onto the lips of Jesus to sort of make Jesus do the work for him of complaining about this marginalization. Again, I'm warm to that. I don't know if I'm fully persuaded by that. It seems a little bit too tidy, maybe. Would the earliest readers of John's gospel have read it that way? I don't know. I'm willing to keep that on the table as a way of reading John. At the end of the day, both Matthew and John, and some would say Luke as well.
Yeah.
And some would say Hebrews. At the end of the day, these guys think there's something really big on the line, and they really want to push. It was later Christians that came along and said, "You Jews are Christ killers. Right? You're the deist. You've committed deicide. You need to be forever banished as punishment for the sin of rejecting Jesus." All of that stuff horrifically, tragically gets mapped back into these texts in ways that John and Luke, and it would have made them weep. It would have made them crumble in despair if they knew how those same texts were going to be read centuries later. And this is, I think of Paul, holding out hope at near the end of Romans, that Gentile embrace of Jesus is going to make Jews jealous, and the Jews are going to come running back, and all Israel will be saved because they're going to see see the error of their ways, and Paul's kinfolk will embrace Messiah. What would Paul think if he were alive today after all the centuries of anti-Semitism, of Christian anti-Semitism, culminating in the Holocaust? I mean, his dream, his passion, that what drove him around the Mediterranean was to convert Gentiles so that his cousins and uncles and aunts would recognize, the wisdom of God in the cross and in the resurrection. And what have we done with that? I don't mean to end on a downer note, but that's part of the reality of the New Testament conversation that's going on.
Yeah. Well, and I want to end up on an upper note about that, and that is not what you are about, right? And so tell us one more time, what is it? What is the ministry you're working with? What are you doing? What are your goals, and how can we promote you?
Yes, thanks. So I'll hold up a little card here just to get it in the screen. NEME. You can pronounce that however you want. The Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East is a new initiative, and we're trying to be a resource to the church, particularly the evangelical, or what do you call it, the evangelical adjacents, those who are friendly with historic evangelicalism. And we're asking, okay, how can we have the conversation better, or maybe how can we change the conversation about the Middle East, really kind of along the lines of what we've been talking about today. And so we've got a website, NEME, we've got Facebook and Twitter and all of the usual stuff. We're posting podcasts and webinars and articles and resources that people can use, maybe to elevate the conversation. One of the things I'm involved in is a conversation group, and we're trying to keep it really even between non-Christian Zionists like myself and Christian Zionists. And we're recruiting people into this conversation. We're just doing it quietly. I won't name any names, because we're trying to build friendships, trust, understanding across this, what has been a chasm, what has been kind of a battle zone, a DMZ, a divide, where people throw words like supersessionism or anti-Semitism across the divide, or they dismiss the arguments of the other because they don't really know that other person, right? What if you and I disagreed strongly, and somebody caricatured your position, and I said, actually, no, Brad doesn't say that. Let me explain to you what Brad thinks. Let me help you understand his. I disagree with him, but this is what he's saying, not what you're. What if we were like that? What if we had that kind of conversation? And that, I'm afraid, these days in the polarized world of American politics and the American church, is a big challenge. But what if we pulled it off? Right?
Yeah.
So that's what I'm involved in. That's what I'm engaged in. And we're also engaged in education. So we're wanting to elevate voices in the Middle East that aren't maybe heard. People, young authors, folks that need to have need a little bit of help to amplify their voice. Those are the sorts of things that we're doing, and I'm honored to be a part of it.
Well, I'm grateful that you're doing that. I want to encourage you and keep up the good work. And Clarion Journal is one of the places where this will appear. And if you see articles or voices that you would recommend for our publication, we'd be happy to make space for that.
Wonderful. That's a great opportunity. I'd love to continue working with you.
All right. Well, we'll do a follow-up someday. I know that we've in some ways we went long, but in other ways it's just such a big topic that we barely skipped a stone over the surface. But I really appreciate you, and thank you so much.
And there's other voices that I'll recommend you bring on to your, get me out of the way and bring in some other folk, and you'll enjoy them as well. So
okay,
great.
Thanks, Bruce.